Cormac McCarthy is widely regarded as one of America's greatest authors, which naturally has made his work an attractive source for cinematic adaptations. And yet, despite 4 of his books having already made it to the big screen, McCarthy has nevertheless gained the somewhat enigmatic reputation of being unfilmable. There's a variety of reasons for this, but mainly it emerged out of the many failed attempts to adapt what is arguably McCarthy's magnum opus, his grand, ultra-violent historical epic, Blood Meridian, which follows a group of scalp hunters on the American frontier who are trapped in a repetitive cycle of extreme violence that just goes on and on without any apparent meaning or resolution. Needless to say, it's an incredibly graphic and challenging novel, yet it's also considered a modern classic. It has an engaging and thrilling story that feels at once grounded and mythic. It has an absolutely iconic villain by the name of Judge Holden, who is this big, bald, baby-faced psychopath who is as intelligent as he is depraved, an almost Satan-like character who's twisted his unspeakable carnage into some kind of divine calling. This is the nature of war, he argues at one point, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. As such, the novel also explicitly grapples with major philosophical themes such as human nature, existence, war, violence, and the essence of America, which, altogether, definitely seem like the right ingredients for a harrowing masterpiece of a movie. Tommy Lee Jones, who was a personal friend of McCarthy, was the first to try his hand at adapting Blood Meridian back in the 90s, but the project never made it to light because it was deemed too graphic. The same fate befell Ridley Scott in the early 2000s, who had a producer on board and a screenplay by William Monahan, the Oscar-winning writer of The Departed, but ultimately they too couldn't transform the novel's extreme violence into an acceptable movie. Another decade later, James Franco gave it a shot, and got as far as filming half an hour of test footage. But just before setting out to make the real thing, he fell out with his producer, lost the adaptation rights, and the promise of a Blood Meridian movie once again went dormant. That is, until now. In 2023, the production company New Regency acquired the rights and brought in John Hillcoat, who also directed the adaptation of McCarthy's The Road, to film the Unfilmable novel. John Logan, writer of movies such as Gladiator, The Aviator, and Skyfall, has been hired to write the screenplay, and with that, it looks like the project might finally see the light of day. But of course, getting a Blood Meridian movie doesn't automatically mean that we're getting a good one, for the challenge of adapting McCarthy goes beyond accounting for his depictions of violence. If you've read any of his books, you know that what makes him so remarkable is not just what he writes about, but more so how he writes about it. The distinct prose style McCarthy used to explore the ideas and themes in his novels is what made him such a giant of American fiction. Cameron Ho wrote in a Cineast article, "Yes, his meandering plots and merciless, brutal worlds are significant obstacles to overcome, but any screenwriter also has the task of trying to replicate his unique literary voice in a drastically different medium."
In the end, Mr. Cole, we all get cured of our sentiments.
Personally speaking, this is how I became so enamored with McCarthy in the first place. It wasn't the grittiness, but the poetry of his writing that grabbed me. For me, reading his work was like seeing a Terrence Malick movie for the first time, in the sense that it felt like it unlocked in my brain an entirely new language, an entirely new way of seeing and thinking about the world, which quite significantly reconfigured my relationship to it. You know, Malick's cinematic style doesn't just serve to tell a story, it also puts you in an altered state of being. It invokes an emotional awareness, a kind of poetic feeling that connects you to some deeper strata of experience, one that lingers long after you've left the theater, and that on some level does not ever fully leave you again. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that a McCarthy adaptation has to be like a Malick movie, just that it has to achieve a similar effect. It has to reach for that same depth of poetry that made reading his work so engaging.
And I think that's also what people are drawn to, because there is a sense of like deep, like wanting to know and like thinking about these big, heavy topics and existential ideas, and then just ruminating in that for a few hundred pages. And it's like it's all wrapped in there. It's not just a story. There's a lot more.
This is Jake from the channel Man Carrying Thing, who's read a lot more books than I have and was kind enough to assist me on this one.
Hi, I'm excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of yours.
We recently had a long discussion about McCarthy, covering his style, his themes, and his rising relevance in a time of diminishing attention spans.
Especially men, where it's like we talk about the male literacy crisis or whatever, and men aren't reading or anything. So
we also discussed our own dream McCarthy adaptations and made a list of great movies that weren't actually written by McCarthy, but which are close enough to his style and content that they may as well have been. But I'll get back to that in the end. First, to get a better understanding of the essence of Cormac McCarthy's work and what it would mean to faithfully adapt it, we can take a look at the varying results of the previous McCarthy adaptations. See what they got right, where they fell short, and what lessons there are to be learned as we move closer to the white whale that is Blood Meridian.
Down in Mexico, they got ranches so big, you can't ride from one end to the other in a week.
The first movie to be adapted from a McCarthy novel was All the Pretty Horses, a coming-of-age story about John Grady Cole, a teenager who, after losing the ranch he grew up on, travels to Mexico with his best friend, where they encounter all kinds of trouble after John falls in love with the daughter of a wealthy rancher.
It's a tough book to adapt, I think, because it is like on the surface of it like a very romantic story, you know, and you could go into that. But what makes it perfect is that his writing doesn't it's not romantic. It's very like dry and factual, and that's what makes it special. That's what makes that book so unique.
Ostensibly, the movie is largely faithful to the chain of events depicted in the novel. It did do that thing where they cast 30-year-old actors as teenagers, which I'd say is probably the one genuinely bad creative decision insofar as capturing the essence of the source material goes. Because in the novel, the youngsters acting like naive 16-year-olds really is a quintessential part of the story, and that just doesn't translate the same when you're looking at clearly grown men.
What is this, cactus juice or something?
I don't know. Got a little kick to it though, don't it?
Oh, I think it does.
Now, I say this is probably the one genuinely bad creative decision because when it comes to the movie's other shortcomings, and there are plenty, it's not director Billy Bob Thornton or screenwriter Tad Talley who are to blame, but rather the studio that came in after Thornton had finished his version, took the movie away from him, and absolutely gutted it.
And then I did my cut, which was 2 hours and 42 minutes, 18 minutes shorter than what they said I could have. And then they set about cutting it to under 2 hours because they always wanted it under 2 hours. So the movie that came out in the theaters was 1 hour 59 minutes. And it's amazing what you can lose in about 20, 30 minutes of real character stuff that means something.
In their revision of the movie, the studio replaced the apparently haunting musical score with one that was a lot more traditionally Western. The love story was pulled to the foreground and placed at the center, which didn't just come at the expense of fleshing out other important elements like John Grady's friendship with his buddy Lacey Lawrence, but it also ripped away the context and atmosphere that actually gives the entire story its distinctive feel and meaning.
This ranch has been in my family as long as anyone can remember. My granddaddy used to tell me this was heaven on earth, just like his granddaddy used to tell him.
What's so remarkable about the novel is that it takes its time to establish a rather melancholic awareness of the passage of time, of history being on the verge of devouring not just John Grady Cole's personal heritage, but a broader way of life as well, which is a feeling that thematically underpins much, if not all, that comes after. The romanticism for a mythical past, the disillusionment that follows from trying to actually attain it, and the general feeling of being at the mercy of all these greater forces of time and history. But in the movie, all of this is either skipped over or reduced to brief moments of narration that quickly relay the information without capturing the emotional weight that should accompany it.
All I ever wanted was to live out there like he did. Come to find out, Mama aims to sell it.
And with them, all they want is, okay, so now you killed the girl, now you put her in a bag, and now you get to the car, and there's the police, you don't see all the stuff in between. And that's what happened.
This is the main problem, right? You can't simply cheat your way to this kind of mood setting. It needs to be cultivated with care and attention, and it's the lack of it here that demonstrates exactly how well McCarthy does this in his novels. Because while his writing in All the Pretty Horses is mostly to the point and unromantic, he'll occasionally interrupt himself with these highly memorable moments of extravagant lyricism.
There's like this surreal exaggeration and the sense of melodrama on the sentence by sentence level. I don't know how to think of it besides the way he'll describe a night sky and it'll just stop you in your tracks and then the rest of the page will be very simple. He said this, he put this here, he placed this here, blah 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 blah, and it just gets this rhythm, and then you'll get a sentence that just breaks you out of that rhythm, and it's
the boy who rode on slightly before him said a horse not only as if he'd been born to it, which he was, but as if, were he begot by malice or mischance into some queer land where horses never were, he would have found them anyway. Would have known that there was something missing for the world to be right, or he right in it, and would have set forth to wander wherever it was needed for as long as it took until he came upon one, and he would have known that that was what he sought, and it would have been. How do you translate this kind of prose, this kind of poetry? Because it's not just self-indulgent, fruity language. If you look at that passage again, the metaphor that McCarthy uses here isn't just beautifully written, it's also highly specific. It's like a story in and of itself. It paints such a clear picture, which then in turn illuminates something meaningful about the subject it's relating to. In this case, John Grady's strong connection to horses. We see some of this in the movie, mainly through the romanticized visuals, but honestly, compared to McCarthy's evocative specificity, these images just look crude and generic by comparison, as if cinema is actually the more primitive medium that can only speak in plain impressions. Which of course isn't true, but it does go to show that when you're adapting McCarthy, it's that kind of mood setting and poetic world building that, arguably above all else, needs to be accounted for.
I was sheriff of this county when I was 25 years old. Hard to believe.
I think it's safe to say that No Country for Old Men is the most successful McCarthy adaptation so far. The movie closely follows the novel in terms of plotting, characters, themes, and, arguably, in its overall feeling, with the starkness of McCarthy's prose being reinterpreted by the Coen brothers into a similarly aesthetic cinematic language. There's no music, no real glimpses into what the characters are feeling or what really drives them. It's all presented very matter-of-factly, as if you're watching some kind of chemical reaction play itself out, which was also true for the novel, where McCarthy maintains his position as a detached, almost indifferent observer, just relaying the sequence of events as he witnessed them. But the one interruption here, and which I think was the real stroke of genius in their adaptation of the novel, was the way the Coen brothers used Tommy Lee Jones's character Sheriff Bell to bookend the movie with two monologues, an opening narration over an empty landscape and a closing recounting of a dream, centered tightly on a wary face.
Then I woke up.
Why these moments are so important, in combination with Jones's empathetic performance and Roger Deakins' beautiful cinematography, is because they take what could have very easily been a straightforward tale of crime, just as All the Pretty Horses could have been and sadly did become a straightforward coming-of-age romance, and reframes it into a greater poetic context, makes it transcend the boundaries of genre to tell a greater story about the clash between the troubled human spirit and the vast and empty cosmic expanse it is subjected to.
A man would have to put his soul at hazard. You'd have to say, okay, I'll be part of this world.
McCarthy also offers these same monologues in the novel, and even goes a bit further by placing us inside Belle's mind every few chapters or so. But I think the movie brings over just enough of it to invoke the same melancholic atmosphere, the same pathos, without it becoming too overbearing, which is an issue we'll see a bit later when we get to James Franco's adaptation.
Some say man. Y'all son of a bitch!
No, No Country for Old Men was a success on pretty much every front. It did well at the box office, won a bunch of Oscars, and as far as adapting McCarthy goes, this second attempt at a McCarthy adaptation, Cameron Ho concluded, demonstrated that not only was it possible, but there was also a commercial and critical appetite for seeing McCarthy's works on screen. There is, however, one major caveat to all this, which is that No Country for Old Men was originally written by McCarthy as a screenplay, not as a novel. This explains why the Coen brothers were able to copy so much of McCarthy's writing pretty much verbatim, save for a few minor differences that I've already discussed in another video. It's because the novel was born out of a story that was already specifically arranged to become a movie. Much of the novel reads like a ready-made movie script, Guardian editor Jason Cowley wrote. There's minimal descriptive scene setting and long sections of vigorous dialogue, which the Coen brothers have put straight into the actors' mouths.
You can't stop what's coming. It ain't all waiting on you. That's vanity.
Yeah, No Country for Old Men and The Road that are much more easy to adapt because they're a lot more realistic descriptions of like what's happening. They're just a lot simpler when he's in that mode, which I would describe more as like a Hemingway style mode when it's just like the very literal actions of what's happening on the page.
2013's The Counselor is technically not an adaptation, as it was never anything other than a screenplay, but it was written by McCarthy, and it's worth taking a little detour for, as it does reveal more clearly another important consequence of McCarthy's slightly different writing style here.
The point, Counselor, is that you may think there are things that these people are simply incapable of. They are not.
Directed by Ridley Scott, perhaps as some consolation for not getting his Blood Meridian movie off the ground. The Counselor is about a man who made one fatal mistake and pretty much spends the entire movie realizing what he has gotten himself into.
You are now at the crossing and you want to choose, but there's no choosing there. There's only accepting.
You know, it's that classic McCarthyian sense of fatalism, of characters being entangled in webs of causal reactions that they cannot understand, let alone control.
Every dumb thing I ever done in my life, there was a decision I made before that got me into it.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it.
It was never the dumb thing. There's always some choice I made before it.
But what's so fascinating about The Counselor is seeing just how much McCarthy has redirected his thematic musings from the descriptions into the dialogues. And not just to one character, but virtually every single one of them, from the diamond dealer to the Mexican cartel boss, speaks like they're some kind of philosopher.
I think truth has no temperature.
The consumer of the product is essential to its production.
But reflective men often find themselves at a place removed from the realities of life.
The heart of any culture is to be found in the nature of the hero. Who is that man who is revered?
And mind you, I say all this appreciatively. I know the movie has been pretty heavily criticized, but honestly, I actually kind of love it. Aside from the fact that the movie's well structured, thematically rich, and rewarding on multiple viewings, aside from the movie being obviously highly quotable while also having some striking visuals that you won't soon forget, I feel like the idea of all the characters feeling slightly divorced from reality, feeling as if they've all been raised on a literary diet that solely consists of other McCarthy novels, actually adds something meaningful to the story world as a whole. Something that is also there in No Country for Old Men, albeit with more subtlety, which is just that hint of mythical elevation. It's the idea that we're not watching literal reality or history, but rather McCarthy's fabled rendition of it. You know, as realistic or historical as McCarthy's novels can get, to me at least, they ultimately do still feel like stories. They're closer to myths than non-fiction, which is in part what makes his extreme violence and bleak, brutal worlds somewhat palatable. It's because the storytelling transports you to some other realm slightly beyond, where, even when it's cloaked in the trappings of our own, you can explore these matters more safely with a kind of psychological distance. And this, I think, will also be very important for Blood Meridian, and also explains why the next McCarthy adaptation was so uniquely challenging.
Each day is more gray than the one before. It is cold, and growing colder, as the world slowly dies.
While the movie adaptation of The Road had the seemingly similar luxury of being based on one of McCarthy's more starkly written Hemingway-styled novels.
Yeah, there's nothing really fantastical in The Road. It's all very, like, process-oriented of, like, okay, we gotta go get some food, and now the wheel on our cart broke, and we gotta deal with that, and that sort of thing.
Director John Hillcoat did face the daunting task of having to adapt what is probably McCarthy's most emotionally intimate work. There's no sprawling cast of characters here, no evil yet entertaining villains. It's just a father and his son struggling through a world of absolute desolation.
You have to just keep carrying the fire.
What fire?
Fire inside you.
Even now, with the post-apocalyptic genre having become widely prolific, The Road still stands out for its unrelenting bleakness. Unlike most other works in the genre, which all tend to have some element of escapist fantasy, some symbolic reclamation of personal control, a desired resetting of society, or a blissful return to nature, McCarthy's barren wasteland has no such inviting attributes whatsoever. Instead, what it does offer is a harrowing and heartbreakingly sincere reflection of the awe-inspiring force of parenthood, capturing both the unfathomable depth of despair in the face of inevitable suffering, as well as the profound will to live that emerges when your heart lives outside of you.
If I were God, I would have made the world just so, and no different. And so I have you. I have you.
To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about the movie, both in its own right and as an adaptation of the novel. I think Hillcoat made an admirable attempt at translating the poetry on the page, and beautifully set the stage and the tone of this story through an impactful combination of imagery and character work. Viggo Mortensen in particular lends a haunting presence, and his narration does invoke McCarthy's distinct voice. They do this thing that they also did in the adaptation of All the Pretty Horses, where some of McCarthy's descriptive prose is carried over as voice-over narration.
All I know is the child is my warrant, and if he is not the word of God, then God never spoke.
And yet, despite the movie doing seemingly everything right, it still feels like something is missing, like some ineffable quality that elevated the brutalist storytelling in the novel, or that at least gave it a different tonal resonance, got slightly disformed in the translation, and left us with a movie that is just too grim.
You ain't gotta do this to me, man. You ain't gotta do me like this.
Film critic Roger Ebert said something similar in his review of the movie, said that for him it lacked the same core of emotional feeling that was there in the novel. However, as he also added, I'm not sure this is any fault of the filmmakers. The external events of the novel have been boldly solved, and this is an awesome production. But McCarthy's prose has the uncanny ability to convey more than dialogue and incident. It's as dense as poetry. How could the director and writer have summoned the strength of McCarthy's writing? Could they have used more stylized visuals instead of relentless realism? I have no idea. Perhaps McCarthy, like Faulkner, is all but unfilmable. In this sense, weirdly enough, the road had me thinking that Blood Meridian might actually be the easier adaptation. Because while it is significantly more violent and depraved than The Road ever is, it does also have a clearer counterbalance to offset the bleakness and carnage. It does have more of those elements to help create some psychological distancing, which, as it turns out, might be something that you do really need. Like No Country for Old Men, Blood Meridian has a wide variety of interesting and even somewhat goofy side characters that veer towards comedic satire without ever becoming full caricatures. And that, with the right casting, could add some levity and humanity and help to establish that more mythical atmosphere that slightly divorces the story from its otherwise overly harsh reality.
Did you not hear me? We can't give out no information.
Blood Meridian also obviously has its own iconic villain with a distinct look and distinct philosophy that, unlike the more quiet Anton Chigurh, he is extremely vocal about, much more akin to the way McCarthy wrote his characters in The Counselor, you know, always ready to launch into some kind of philosophical monologue.
The judge is kind of funny, I mean, in certain ways. It's like he doesn't even exist in his own book. Like he's almost like aware of the book itself and is just very enjoyable to read, his thoughts and opinions, and it's frightening. And he's like a frightening character, especially those last 100 pages when it becomes like a chase thriller. No, I totally get what you mean, how a lot of it is kind of goofy.
But there is one last problem to solve though, one that none of the adaptations so far have really had to contend with. And that's the problem of adapting a McCarthy story that, on top of being violent and bleak, also doesn't have a sympathetic protagonist to latch on to.
He was of German and Irish bloods. His name was Lester Ballard, a child of God, much like yourself perhaps.
In 2013, James Franco released his adaptation of McCarthy's Child of God, which follows the violent and increasingly grotesque misadventures of a dispossessed man in the Tennessee countryside. From a literary perspective, it's probably the closest book to Blood Meridian to have been adapted. This is in part because of its challenging subject matter, but also because, unlike the books from the other adaptations, Child of God dates all the way back to the 70s, to McCarthy's earlier writing era in which his prose was still a lot more dense and baroque, and of which Blood Meridian might just be the pinnacle. Franco clearly tried to capture as much of this lavish prose as he could, arguably too much so. There's passages that appear as voiceovers from different narrators, which resemble the chapters in the book where different townspeople share random anecdotes about the troubled main character.
He had that rifle from when he was almost just a boy.
I'll tell you another thing he did one time.
Some of McCarthy's writing is just directly put on the screen as text, and it all feels a bit jumbled, a bit overbearing and superficial. Like it's technically showing us the thing, but it's not generating its original effect. It's not properly translating it for this new medium.
Drop the rifle, Ballard.
It also doesn't help that the movie was a very low-budget production, one where the presentation of flat colors, cheap music and handheld camera doesn't feel like it really captures anything meaningful about the story or the characters as much as it just reveals the stylistic indifference of a filmmaker working in a hurry. To be fair though, the low budget was a deliberate choice, as it meant that Franco didn't have to worry about reaching a wide audience or about getting negative critic reviews, which is a freedom he leveraged to film in graphic detail all the more transgressive elements of the story that would have been too much for a mainstream movie. Main actor Scott Hayes also displayed a genuine commitment to the part here, which is absolutely commendable, even though the resulting picture did leave me with mixed feelings about the potential for a faithful Blood Meridian movie. Because on the one hand, seeing an uncompromising vision of Lester Ballard as he debases himself and commits all kinds of heinous acts does demonstrate that adapting those unapologetically repulsive aspects of McCarthy's work is definitely possible if you're just fearless enough to commit to them. But then again, the way it clashes with the low production value and with Franco's superficial devotion to the novel also proves that if you actually want to elevate all this into a true portrait of the human condition like McCarthy did, you need a whole lot more than simply being unflinching in the face of the grotesque. To once again turn to the great Roger Ebert, Franco gracelessly follows Hayes from one sordid misadventure to the next with no feeling for why McCarthy made all these decisions the first time around. It's a great ad for the book because what's missing from the film's conception of the characters is all on the page. There's just too much silence where there ought to be prose. For me, the main lesson for Blood Meridian here, in addition to everything we've already discussed, is that any filmmaker seeking to adapt McCarthy has to pay close attention to his conception of humanity as well. I'd say that this, whether he was aware of it or not, was probably what Franco struggled with the most in his adaptation, and which will no doubt be a serious challenge for Blood Meridian as well. Because while I'd argue that it's relatively easy to depict characters who are truly vile, who are just rotten and irredeemable to the core, turning Judge Holden into a compelling Anton Chigurh-like villain, that's probably gonna be the fun part, right? But it's the characters in his orbit, and the kid especially, the youngster who is our main point of view character, for whom things get a lot more complicated. Because like Lester Ballard, the kid is not some kind of grotesque other. Even though we don't really get to know what's going on inside his mind, and even though he partakes in some truly horrendous acts, he too, in the end, is much like McCarthy's child of God. Someone much like yourself, perhaps. And what I think is the secret magic to how McCarthy approaches such deplorable, sinful, or otherwise fallen characters is the way he presents them, not necessarily with sympathy, but he does invoke some strange form of intimacy so that even when they're at their most transgressive or evil, there always remains a sliver of empathy for the basic foundations of their humanity. Like an almost involuntary connection between them and the reader, instilling the uneasy suggestion that under the right circumstances, if having suffered enough misfortunes and humiliations and debasements, this could have been you. The flames sawed in the wind, and the embers paled and deepened like the bloodbeat of some living thing eviscerate upon the ground before them. And they watched the fire, which does contain within it something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it and are divided from their origins and are exiles. For each fire is all fires, the first fire and the last ever to be. Going back to Blood Meridian and the promise of its coming adaptation, perhaps more than anything, I feel a renewed sense of reverence for the challenge of the task ahead. Each adaptation of McCarthy's work so far has had its own successes and failures to learn from. I think we have a better understanding now of the need to cultivate a cinematic language that captures McCarthy's poetic prose and tone, to establish the mythic elevation to offset the otherwise overly grim bleakness and violence, and to arrange everything together into a portrait that's true to McCarthy's inquisitive ruminations on humanity.
I know something so great about his writing is that he's not really like preaching a specific philosophy or worldview. I think he's very much just contending and asking these questions of himself.
I don't want to push my chips forward and go out and meet something I don't understand.
But we also saw that these adaptations had a few distinctive advantages to exploit which the filmmakers of Blood Meridian won't be able to rely on. Unlike the lean prose of No Country and The Road, Blood Meridian's writing is incredibly dense, almost biblical. Unlike the relatively accessible coming-of-age tale hidden within All the Pretty Horses, from the pages of Blood Meridian there's definitely no traditional Hollywood narrative to be extracted.
Like, what's great about that book isn't like the literal stuff that happens. I mean, that book is so repetitive. Like, it's just like, and then we went here and killed a bunch of people, and then we went here and killed a bunch of people, and committed war crimes. And they wrote on, exactly.
And unlike Child of God, which was able to be provocative by foregoing a more lavish production and being more content with relative obscurity, Blood Meridian's epic scope and stature as one of the great American novels simply screams for a cinematic adaptation that is equal in size and importance. For indeed, McCarthy's magnum opus is ultimately a work that tackles the grand matters and questions, one in which the onslaught of its carnage is equaled by the power of its revelations.
There's that political element to McCarthy where he's writing about America and Americans, and that feeling of like America is so drawn towards violence and this cycle of violence that keeps happening, and it's like it's so permanent and out of our control in a way that we don't even know how to grasp at it or how to get out of this cycle. And you feel that stretching back all the way to Blood Meridian.
And so perhaps Blood Meridian will prove itself to be unfilmable after all. Yet clearly it hasn't deterred any filmmakers from trying, and even if the currently planned adaptation falls apart or is deemed insufficient, I'm sure that someday others will come along and try again. In this sense, the idea of an unfilmable book is kind of a funny one. It's less of a literal descriptor and more of a challenge, a term that begs for itself to be negated, like the Arthurian sword that cannot be pulled from the stone until the right person comes along and achieves the impossible. McCarthy himself certainly seemed to have been a believer in this. The fact that it's a bleak and bloody story has nothing to do with whether or not you can put it on the screen. That's not the issue, he once said in an interview. The issue is that it would be very difficult to do and would require someone with a bountiful imagination and a lot of balls. But the payoff could be extraordinary.
Yeah, I feel like you'd have to just go really weird with it, but also keep in mind that it is sort of a thriller, like it's an entertaining novel. Ultimately, what I would love is if like a real auteur got their hands on it and did their own thing and just made it their own.
Jake and I discussed in more detail who we would pick for a Blood Meridian adaptation, which other novels of his we would like to see adapted, and we also made a list of movies that weren't written by McCarthy, but which still resemble his style and content.
It's like the very grimy 70s feel, and also just like this sense of doom, like the evil that has been brought and unleashed on the global south because of the greed of America, It's very, very McCarthy coded, yeah.
And all of this is just on top of a discussion that goes even deeper into McCarthy's writing.
It feels like there's a lot of influence and history in his writing. So it feels like you're not just reading Cormac McCarthy, you're reading the history of like American literature in a sense.
Our full conversation is available exclusively on our creator-owned streaming platform Nebula. If you like my video essays here on YouTube, then I'm sure you're also going to love Nebula. It's where you can experience my work in its purest form, that is, without any ads or sponsored segments, and enjoy a ton of exclusive content, not just from myself, but from many amazing creators that I greatly admire. Jake, for example, is doing an exclusive video series on Paul Thomas Anderson movies. Thomas Flight recently uploaded a discussion of his favorite film and media books, which had me immediately running to the bookstore. Lindsay Ellis, her groundbreaking essays are now all of them exclusively to Nebula. Jason from Not Just Bikes just made an original Nebula show where he travels to European cities to check out their public transit systems, which admittedly I binged through in a single afternoon when I should have been working. And all of this is just the tip of the iceberg, and the best part is, all of this comes at the fraction of the price of other streaming services. For less than $3 a month with my personal link, you can start enjoying this incredible platform for yourself, which has also just become such a wonderful community that has supported me a lot as a creator. Nebula has given me opportunities that I would never have had otherwise, and which I'm very excited to talk more about in the coming months. Honestly, right now it's one of the best ways to support independent creators like myself, so if you appreciate this kind of content, if you want to watch more of it and feel good about yourself while doing so, I really believe you should consider Nebula. Be sure to use my code for a big 50% discount on a yearly subscription, and I'll see you there.